Hello, folks. It is Tuesday, October 12th, 2021 at 12:30 p.m. And that means it's time for Medcan Presents. Today's webinar is how to make everyday anxiety work for you. And we are going to talk about Dr. Jack Muskat, the Clinical Director of Mental Health at Medcan, who is the host for this webinar. Dr. Jack Muskat is a psychologist, executive coach, speaker, author, and the Clinical Director of Mental Health at Medcan. His clinical practice focuses on issues relating to stress, anxiety, and depression, as well as interpersonal relationships for patients of all ages. His organizational skills offer a deep understanding of how workplace stressors affect personal health and well-being, and he provides clients with insights and tools to better function both at home and work. Dr. Muskat received his PhD in applied psychology from the University of Toronto and is a registered psychologist with the College of Psychologists of Ontario. Jack, how are you today?
Just great, Chris, and I hope everyone listening today had a great Thanksgiving weekend. The weather could not have been more cooperative, and given our topic on how to make everyday anxiety work for you, I hope it's at least reduced some of the anxiety in our listeners and viewers today.
You could, like, honestly, the weather could not have been better this weekend. It was great, wasn't it? I hope you got up. I don't know, did you eat turkey? What did you get up to this weekend?
All of it.
All of it.
All of the
all of the
food
turkey.
groups. All of the food groups.
I definitely had some belt loosening happening myself, so that was good.
For
okay,
sure.
let's jump right into it. We want to, I think, work through solutions here rather than necessarily talk about the problem. But we're going to start with some statistics just to provide context to this. So, of course, the pandemic is a key part of this context. So over the last 19 months, more people have felt a sense of generalized anxiety. Thanks to a Canadian Mental Health Association survey, 77% of adults report feeling so-called negative emotions as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Overall, 41% of Canadians report a decline in their mental health since pandemic's onset. I don't know what the other 59% are experiencing like better, but in any event, but among students, 48% report a decline in mental health. Asked to characterize their emotional response to COVID-19, Canadians responded most frequently by saying they were anxious or worried. So there's a lot of anxiety out there. Dr. Muskat, I think you are experiencing this firsthand in your practice. And do you want to just kind of quickly talk about what you're hearing from your from your client base, and then we can move on to mental health in young people a little bit.
Sure. And I mean, part of what we're hearing is almost a vicious circle where the earlier anxiety during the pandemic, and I recall back to early 2020 where we really didn't know what was happening. And the big problem with stress and anxiety is that when you can't predict or control what's happening, you're even more anxious. And then the conflicting news that was out there, and then the concerns that we have that people have had to uproot their lives, change their lives completely, work from home, the social isolation, all of that exacerbated problems that people may have already had around anxiety. And so that made things a lot worse. And I think you're going to show another slide about young people, but particularly for young people not being in school, school is the workplace of children. And when they're unable to be at school, and when they are learning online in a way that for them is part of their development, depending on their ages, there was an incredible increase in anxiety, both on the parent side and on the student side. So, the areas that we've seen, increased depression, anxiety, irritability, reduced attention span, greater hyperactivity, and then an increase, particularly with adolescent girls, in self-harm gestures, eating disorders, cutting, and then also OCD, which, if you look at it from the point of view of control, is an attempt for people to try to control what they can't predict. So it's been incredibly difficult for all of us. But I'm happy to report as well, as we're moving into the fall and as people are more vaccinated and as kids, even with the exception of the one high school that's now shut in Toronto, I think that we're back to a sort of cautious normal. But it's still an area of concern because of the long length of time that we've had with this, that there's going to be an overhang for some time, at least another year.
And with respect to the survey that we're citing, if in the last, we had 41% of Canadians reporting a decline in their mental health. And here in the Sick Kids survey, we have 70% of school-aged children and then 66% of preschool-aged children reporting a deterioration in mental health, which I think corresponds to your kind of clinical practice. Okay, so generalized anxiety and anxiety disorders. It's important to know when anxious feelings become a cause for concern. So can you, Dr. Muskat, talk about that? And what is the sense? Because when we're talking about this topic, when we're talking about making anxiety work for you and kind of channeling your stress into productive things, there's a difference between this kind of generalized anxiety and what is actually an anxiety disorder. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. And I think that there are, the way I would look at all mental health, it's on a continuum. And mostly we're functional. If we're functional, it means we could be anxious, we can be a little worried, we're getting things done, but we really want to be optimal. So the things that we do in our work and in our personal lives is we want to optimize our relationships, we want to optimize our work productivity, but mostly we're in the middle, we're average, we're competent, we're getting things done. When things move too far to the other side, where we become dysfunctional, where we're unable to deal with the anxiety because it's getting in the way of our ability to function, then that's where we would call it an anxiety disorder, and where it's affecting your ability to sleep, where it's affecting your thoughts, where your appetite is reduced or increased, where you're using what I would call negative coping strategies, and where the most important activity that we found that reduces anxiety, which is exercise and movement, is no longer available to you because you're just not feeling like it, then what happens is all of the stress that is underlying the anxiety has nowhere to go, and you're basically unable to function. It becomes a downward spiral. But most of us are not really in that space, or if we are, and the way in which I would look at it is that if you're feeling anything for 2 weeks, whether it's physical or mental, if you're not able to get rid of it by yourself, if it's that rash that won't go away or that sore joint, usually 2 weeks is a period of time where you might need to get some extra help. But generally speaking, we're all going to have our ups and downs within a narrow range of functionality. And the generalized anxiety we're feeling is actually very, very normal when you look about it in terms of the pandemic. So if we look at, the low grade anxiety, primarily it's worry. And if you look at what I would call stress or anxiety, or most of the mental health issues that we have, or the disorders, and think of them as a 3-part. There's a bio-psycho-social aspect to this, that worry, and I look at it as the biological aspects is kind of how we're hardwired. Some of us are more sensitive, some of us are, it's a genetic predisposition, it's a temperament, it's some of us are more worried than others, and that's natural, that there's going to be a range in that. And then our personalities and our values and our characters and the way in which we deal things, our coping mechanisms, I call our firmware. That's sort of the way in which we approach the way we're feeling anxious. Some people say, I'm just going to work my way through this. Other people say, I've got to lie down, when I'm feeling anxious. And then the third part, which I think is the part that most of us are experiencing, and I would say that with respect to this low-grade anxiety that we're feeling, it's mainly social. And it's social because it's affecting us in terms of our social cohesion, our social isolation, the fact that it's a global event, the facts that we're having to look to leadership both in the scientific community and political community. Our travel plans have been disrupted. Our enjoyment has been disrupted. The second bullet that I have here on FOMO, fear of missing out. This is what I call the biology of desire, the dopamine rush that we get when we're part of something, and when all we can do is see what we're missing or look back to what we used to miss. And those of us who look at some of the social media or the websites that talk about, and for me personally, and for all of us too, when we walk down the street and we see all of our favorite stores closed, restaurants going out of business, it's not just fear of missing out. We are missing out. And not only us, but the business people that have worked so hard to try to survive during this pandemic, which just increases the stress level that we have, because you're looking around and you're saying, what are the normal things that I could be doing? And how can I be part of something that can help me socially do better? And at a certain point, we kind of, what I call it's a kind of social homeostasis. We get into a kind of what Dr. Adam Grant calls languishing or confusion. And this languishing is where we're just getting enough done. We're just doing enough exercise, what I call the minimal viable product. We're just getting the kids off to school. We're just sociable enough. But underneath, we're really feeling, like, if I have to smile at one more person, or if I have to be positive about something, I just can't do it. And we're trying very hard to deal with the cognitive fog. What I will say about us as a society, and maybe Canadians in particular, because we're very polite, is that we tend to give ourselves a lot of room around things that, if we're a little forgetful, if we're not getting things done properly, there's a little forgiveness, because, if you're having a hard time, I'm having a hard time too. And then the last part of the low-grade anxiety, I already spoke about when to seek help, is really when you're feeling that you're not able to cope. I will add one thing. The recent news that just came out hasn't helped. When you hear about Carey Price, the goaltender for the Montreal Canadiens, who is struggling with mental health issues, it would be nice to know what they are. It would be nice to know. It's good that he's come out with that, but what does it really mean? Is it something very serious that we need to be mindful of and helpful around, or is it a tipping point that there are other factors going on? Same with Simone Biles and with Naomi Osaka, who had to leave the French Open due to depression. Moving to another area, when Bill Gates and Melinda decided to split up and get a divorce, I came home and I said to my wife, is there any hope for us? Because if they can't make it, how are we going to make it? So even in this normal situation, and I'm mindful of the fact that we don't know the facts of people's relationships, but when very prominent people who you feel could manage are not managing, it's naturally going to make us feel, how are we going to manage if these superstars can't manage, or they can't figure out a way to live in a 30,000 square foot house? So that just adds to the anxiety that is sort of permeating. It's sort of like the air doesn't feel fresh and we need to ventilate it. And we're not getting enough ventilated mental health air to make us feel that we can get out of this sense that, when is the US Canada land border going to open, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's all of that uncertainty.
Okay. So well, and I think with respect to Bill and Melinda Gates, that was a clash of egos, to my understanding, where it all came down to, I think, anyway, we're going to quickly move on. But
no, I wanted you to finish
she wanted to sign a letter to their stakeholders that he only wanted to. It was all about who is running the ship for their charities, and they couldn't both run the ship, essentially. So anyway, that struck both of them were so high achieving that I think it came, but we're digressing. So the point is that when you're starting to feel anxiety, I think, Dr. Muskat, you have walked me through sort of a crossroads that can happen where you start to feel this anxiety, and it can become this self-reinforcing cycle where the anxiety makes you feel anxiety, and then it becomes this spiral that then becomes destructive. Or you can feel the anxiety and then sort of embrace it, or another term is lean into it, where you try to channel it to more productive ends. And I
Right.
think that's where we want to go now, is how to harness the power of this anxiety and channel it to more productive ends. And so let's talk a little bit about that and your catastrophic thinking and the way that all plays into it.
Okay, and I'm going to actually, it's interesting. We mentioned Bill and Melinda, but they're going to be a great example for us to use. I have three examples I want to talk about quickly, what we do when we're anxious. The first is catastrophic thinking. Catastrophic thinking is that if I don't get Bill, my husband, to sign off on this, then my life is going to collapse. Or Bill saying, if I don't get, it's kind of all or nothing thinking. You know, and we had the personal example that we're hoping to travel to the US, and we couldn't get into a certain hotel in Boston because they weren't accepting out of state or out of the US international travelers, although every other hotel was. And we'd been staying there a long time, and we thought, what are we going to do? Are all the other hotels like that? And then the unintended consequences, we were able to find a better hotel at a better rate. And I think with catastrophic thinking, we start to think, and if we think back, you know, to the toilet paper shortage, where people were actually panicking that they would never find toilet paper again. And I said, well, we can always use my old dissertation if we run out of toilet paper. The idea being, again, that we tend to react irrationally to something that we're not giving ourselves other choices. I use this as an example. I had a lot of Marriott travel points that I didn't use, and so we were going to lose them if we didn't use them. So I said, why do you think we're not using them? We don't really care about staying at this particular hotel brand, or the Aeroplan points, maybe a different story. People want things, and if they don't get them, they get very anxious because they don't feel they have any other choices. So that's what I would be talking about around catastrophic thinking, that, you know, during this pandemic, people have a tendency to think, are things ever going to change? Are we going to get out of this? What's going to happen to me? And the truth is, there are many, many things that are going to happen, and they tend to catastrophize the tendency. The opposite of that is denial, where nothing's going to happen to me, so I don't need to get a vaccination, I don't need to worry, I don't need to social distance, and then, you know, they end up with COVID. So there's not a good solution there. But the catastrophic thinking is the first thing. The second thing that I like to move to is what I call the magical thinking. And the magical thinking is really the opposite of catastrophic thinking. The magical thinking is where we incorrectly attribute causation to events. So, and there's nothing wrong with this. And remember, if we think back to our first slide around stress and around what's going on in the pandemic, our primary way of coping with these anxious feelings is through prediction and control. And when we can't control things, we make things up as well. So we either say things are for the worse, or in this case, things are for the better. You know, I remember when the vaccines first came out, suddenly I have to become a vaccine expert on the kind of vaccine, whether it's a Pfizer, AstraZeneca, or Moderna. And then there was the news that changed daily almost, or weekly, where if you got this kind of vaccine, it was better for this kind of person, not that kind of person. And people were walking around saying, I only want to get this kind of vaccine, when in fact, any of the vaccines work and they're very effective. And so we tend to think that if we get a particular vaccine, or if we only go to this particular big box store but not the other box store, we're going to be okay. Or we say that, you know, I got that promotion through hard work, which may be the truth, but you may have also gotten it through luck, and you may have also gotten it because of other factors that are going on in your life. So we tend to incorrectly attribute causation to events. And what that does is, when we're unable to do that thing, unable to go to the gym, unable to go to that particular gym or do that particular workout, it's sometimes very difficult for people to make the change, to be adaptable and flexible and say, I'll work out in a different way. I can't go to spinning class, so I'll figure out a way to ride my bike, or I'll walk a different path, or I'll do something that's different. And it's not just that one thing. And then the third thing that I think people do incorrectly, and it's related to the magical thinking, but the magical thinking, and if you think about it in terms of disorders, or in terms of OCD, or you know, obsessional thinking, there's a lot of magical thinking around the rituals that people have to use to feel better, that if I make sure that I'm wearing that lucky shirt, or I'm turning the stove off a certain way, that's going to be okay. It's going to reduce my anxiety. That's where you're thinking that you're in control. But the last one, which I think is the one that is fueling most of our anxiety now, is what I call the availability bias. And that's explaining events by the theory that is closest at hand. So, we can talk about, news media reporting of school shootings. So we think schools are dangerous, the number of COVID deaths, but we don't look at whether there were other comorbidities. Over 50% of the people that have been admitted to hospital have other diagnoses. 99% of people who have died from COVID have been over the age of 85. People are dying at younger ages too. There's also um, the fear of long COVID, but these fears in terms of probabilities are very, very, very low, but they heighten our fear and risk. And so we end up thinking that things must be dangerous because the news says it's so. One of the things that I am concerned about, because it has been reported, and I think it's very true, that since 2013, the level of anxiety in adolescent girls has gone up tremendously. Body dysmorphia, which is poor body image, poor feelings about themselves, correlates very strongly with Instagram. There was a recent whistleblower on Facebook talking about that. Around 40% of teenage girls are expressing that. It correlates with 2013 when Facebook bought Instagram, but adolescent girls have always been, I won't say more vulnerable than adolescent boys, but the way in which they're relate to the world, they're much more sensitively attuned to the social news that's out there, to the social dynamics. They're more interpersonally focused sometimes than boys. Not to say that boys aren't, but they'll pick up things more. So they're picking up more of what we're doing in our society. Yes, I don't think social media helps, but at the same time, uh, we have to look at, how we're all dealing with it, and we're all dealing with it poorly. So it's very, very difficult to look at causes, but I would say that we have to look very carefully at not feeling more and more constrained. And what these three biases do, the catastrophic thinking, the magical thinking, and the availability bias, is they make us feel more afraid and more unable to act and more worried, when in fact, if we get out and see people enjoying themselves, as I hopefully most of us did on the weekend, we can see that there's some reality check that we need to do.
So if we're moving toward what to do when you feel some of the anxiety coming along, if we put ourselves in there's this low grade anxiety that maybe comes from social media, or there's, perhaps you're starting to think, well, if I don't do well on this work presentation, then what is going to happen? And so if we put ourselves, Dr. Muskat, in the position of someone who is starting to experience an anxiety spiral, what should you do?
Okay, well, there's really three things that I would be looking at, and one is that I think that we have to channel our energy. So if we go back to what we think the anxiety is about, essentially, we're blaming ourselves at some level. We're saying there's something wrong with us. I shouldn't be feeling this way. And it's kind of paradoxical, because the anxiety biologically is a protective mechanism to let us know that there's danger. The problem is we have no control over the dangers, but we still have the anxiety. So we end up internalizing it and saying, what's wrong with me? Why am I feeling so anxious? So the first thing I think we need to practice is self-acceptance, and forget about being perfect. And what I mean by self-acceptance is saying, I am a worthy person. And that's an important statement to say, because it leads to the next thing that we need to do. If you believe that you're a worthy person, then the things that you would want to do is, so what do worthy people do? They regain self-respect. They do things that is important for themselves, that helps them. They get rid of their negative coping strategies. They do positive things, and they substitute positive activities for negative ones. The challenge is that very often what's missing, and this is where psychotherapy can help, therapy, but also social support, is that we know what we want to do. And in fact, I tell all my patients, I don't even tell them, they tell me, but when they sit down, I say, you already know what you need to do. And they often nod, yes, I do know what I need to do. So why aren't you doing it? And that's what we get into: the negative self-talk, the negative thinking, the lack of confidence, the lack of faith that we can actually do something. And so by starting with the fact that you are an agent of change, that you can make something happen, and then you do it, then what are the three things that I would then be doing? Well, the first I would be doing, when they say you're digging a hole, stop digging. Start avoiding the things that aren't good for you: the junk food, the too much alcohol, the drugs, the cannabis, the negative people that are in your life. I mean, for many people, Thanksgiving was a very difficult time because some people were vaccinated, some people weren't. Family gatherings were struggles for some families, where there was anxiety about who should be attending or not attending. And I think that there's, a problem around the accommodation there. But in effect, and I've made a decision, and it's both personal and professional, that I'm only going to spend time with people that are positive around getting better through this pandemic. And while I have some sympathy for those that are unvaccinated, unless there's a pre-existing health concern as an adverse effect to immunization or myocarditis, then CAMH has a clinic to help people get over vaccination anxiety. But you got to get poked, just like the kids in school need to have 9 vaccines. So I want to have people in my life that are positive. I want you to have people in your life that are doing the right thing, that are helping you. So avoiding negative people, avoiding negative experiences. And then the next step of that, the bridge, would be substituting positive for negative behaviors. So if you're doing something positive, so if you're drinking a soda and lime, if you're going for a walk, if you're reading a book, then you're not binging on scary Netflix shows, or drinking alcohol that you shouldn't be doing, or spending time that doing things that aren't helpful. And then the last thing is learning new habits. The pandemic has only focused on the negative, but when we had our guest on one of our podcasts, Chris, Dr. Stephen Taylor from UBC, he said that up to 20% of people found new meaning in their lives during this period. There was a reset, and they were able to find new things to do. And so those three things are really the things that I would expect people to be looking at, and looking at this anxiety as a signal that, yes, it's normal. You should be feeling this way because it's weird times. But at the same time, don't let that be something that pathologizes you or makes you feel incapable of changing your behavior, and getting out. And I say the moving your body is probably the most important thing you can do, whether it's intense physical exercise or just walking. It affects your mood, it affects your mind, it affects your mental health. So if you're unable to do that, find a buddy, find some social supports to help you do that, so that you're not feeling totally alone.
So thank you for that. And I think that's going to be helpful for a lot of people, Dr. Muskat. One question that came in that in advance of the webinar, and folks, I should mention that use the chat function or the Q&A function, and we can respond. We'll spend a little bit of time responding to questions from webinar attendees. But what do you do if it's not you, but somebody who you love, or perhaps a friend or a relative? You can see them getting into the anxiety spiral. You can see, that they're feeling this kind of generalized anxiety, or perhaps moving into a panic attack. How can you be supportive for that person, and perhaps talk them out of it in a way that feels supportive? I think
Right.
years ago, we would have, been a little more, there would have been conflict. You're saying your feelings are wrong, but what is the right thing to do in this situation?
Right. Well, there actually and it's a great question. It's a question I should have anticipated, because it happens every time we do one of these webinars, Chris, is that, well, it's true. If it's not me, then it's you. So how can I help you if you're my loved one, if you're my spouse or my kid? And particularly with kids, listen, be available to listen. Don't try to solve the problem. Don't try to push it. But before I even say listen, look in the mirror, look at your own behavior. Are you irritable? Are you spending a lot of time in your study with the door closed? Are you binging on Netflix? Are you a good role model for whoever that person is? And it's not to say that we have to be perfect, but if you're not, one of the things you can say to that person is, you know what, you're absolutely right. I know you're struggling with this. I'm struggling with it too. So being able to provide empathy, but at the same time, allowing them to feel accepted, and then say, how can we solve this together? Maybe we'll go for a bike ride together. Well, I don't feel like doing that. So maybe we'll go for a walk together, or I'm here to listen, or maybe we'll spend more time doing something that you want to do. And if that doesn't work, one of the things about professional help, and we've got a lot of of therapy available out there. We've put a lot of money into mental health, and it's more important that someone find a good therapist that they can relate to. What people will say to me very often, and I sometimes forget, is they say, "I'm so glad I was able to talk to someone about this. I can't talk to my spouse, I can't talk to my kids, or I don't want to, but I can talk to you. And in fact, I'm not even doing anything. They're doing all the talking, but we're providing a safe container for individuals to come to therapy and to be able to talk about things that are really bothering them. So in a sense, they rehearse what's bothering them. We hear it, we act as a sounding board, and we help them come up with solutions through cognitive behavior therapy and other means to really just understand. But the first thing is people want to feel that they're heard. So if we just listen to others, that's the first step.
You told me a great story, I think, about an experience that happens so often to you, which is, somebody comes in, it's the first time you've seen them. You say, what seems, you say whatever it is that you say to open the conversation, and then they talk for, 45, 50 minutes. And then that's all they needed was to get it off their chest and to be listened to in a way that you are so good at, which I think, so that's something that, if you do feel unable to channel this anxiety into a productive pursuit, if you feel anxious about something coming up, then it makes sense to channel that anxiety into work to make that thing that is coming up, whether it's, I think a lot of people or a lot of families, I mean, we certainly did, if you're hosting Thanksgiving dinner, then you feel anxiety about that. And then, but you channel that into effort to make that event the best thing that it can be, or,
Right.
or you channel it toward productive pursuit.
Right. You try to accommodate, but what happens, and so we're
You're
therapists.
rescuing me. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
we try to do it, but what happens, and it's not, and it happens to me too, where I'm so invested in something. So let's talk about Thanksgiving. So, we're finally going to have it indoors, but and somebody wants to, or a number of people want to come and they're unvaccinated. Well, I feel okay in terms of my own stress level, having it outdoors with good ventilation and having it short, like a kind of drive-through Thanksgiving type of thing. I'm joking, but what I'm saying is that it is very hard to get COVID in a well-ventilated outdoor setting if you're vaccinated. And even if you're around unvaccinated people, the dangers of unvaccinated people catch from a vaccinated person, who incidentally won't be giving it to you if they have no symptoms, but more importantly, the unvaccinated person could be a carrier themselves and are at risk. So there's that. But if you're so intent on having your way and the other side's intent, then what a therapist can do is help create a middle ground, or at least help you prioritize what's really important. So maybe you have part of it, like you'll have a reception where it's outdoors, but then the people who are vaccinated can come indoors. So, there are many ways that a professional can really help in getting people to deal with things. And then the other thing is the emotional content that is there, that I think people wisely know they don't want to be talking to that individual around whatever their concerns are. They need to speak to a professional to help them prioritize, to be a sounding board, and to give them some steps and some tools to help them deal with the problems they're facing.
So we'll wrap this up because we've
Sure.
gone a little bit over time.
Okay.
But in terms of other resources, so if you do feel like you need to speak with a professional, mental well-being at medcan.com is the email to send to arrange an appointment with Dr. Jack Muskat or a member of Dr. Jack Muskat's growing team. In terms of future webinars, things that are coming up, our next webinar, so in November, we have how to build a high performance team. This is with the mountaineer, the 7 summits expedition leader, Scott Kress, who he's the founder of Summit Team Building. He's climbed the tallest mountains on each of the 7 continents, and he's built teams that excelled in even the harshest conditions. The trick here is when everybody is working hybrid, how do you create a culture, a team ethic, a team ethos that helps everybody to feel well and feel heard and feel like they're contributing in a way. And so that's what the next webinar is going to be about. That's Tuesday, November 9 at 12:30 p.m. And you can register on the Medcan webpage, medcan.com/listen, watch, and learn. And the link is right at the on the main page there. Okay, that's great. Thank you so much to Dr. Jack Muskat. Thanks to the webinar attendees, and thanks again to everybody who came in with questions. We do. Okay, and so these questions are actually in the chat. Those aren't questions, those are thank yous. So Dr. Muskat, thanks so much and have a great day. Enjoy the wonderful weather.
Thank you, Chris. Best to you.
Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.